Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are following a major breaking development unfolding across Europe as Russian President Vladimir Putin delivers a powerful and direct statement declaring that fighting will stop only when Ukrainian forces withdraw from all territories, Russia claims, which has immediately sparked global reactions and intense debate as nations analyze what this announcement means for the future of the war and the stability of the region. This announcement came during a high-level briefing in Moscow where Putin laid out his conditions for halting military operations, making it clear that Russia sees territorial withdrawal as the only acceptable path to ending hostilities and setting off a wave of responses from Kyiv, Washington, Brussels, and major world capitals that are now trying to decipher the strategic intent behind these words. Ukrainian officials responded within minutes, dismissing the statement as unacceptable and insisting that Ukraine will not retreat from its internationally recognized land, and calling the demand an attempt to force Ukraine into surrendering sovereignty under pressure, which they say will not happen regardless of the military situation on the ground or diplomatic tensions abroad. Military analysts around the world are examining the timing of this announcement, noting that Russian troops have been intensifying operations along key front lines and that this declaration may be linked to strategic goals, including building momentum for negotiations, strengthening bargaining position, or signaling confidence in battlefield advances that are currently being reported from multiple sectors in the east and south. On the ground, Ukrainian soldiers continue to face intense pressure with drone strikes, artillery fire, and armored pushes, creating a challenging environment that has forced commanders to reposition units, resupply faster, and adapt their defensive strategies as Russian forces attempt to break through fortified lines that have held for months but are now facing new waves of attacks. NATO allies have called for emergency consultations in response to Putin's statement as leaders from across Europe express concern about the escalation potential and the possibility that Russia's new stance may harden its negotiating position further, making diplomacy more difficult and raising the risk of a prolonged military confrontation that carries consequences for global energy markets, food security, and regional stability. In Washington, U.S. officials condemned Putin's declaration, calling it an ultimatum that undermines peace efforts, while reaffirming that the United States will continue supporting Ukraine with defense assistance, intelligence, and diplomatic backing as long as Kyiv needs it, and emphasizing that any peace agreement must be based on international law rather than unilateral demands. At the United Nations, diplomats warned that the window for negotiation is shrinking as both sides become more entrenched in their positions, and humanitarian organizations caution that the conflict is taking an increasingly devastating toll on civilians who are caught in frontline zones facing shortages, blackouts, and forced evacuations. As winter conditions worsen and shelters struggle to support populations displaced by continued fighting, economic experts are monitoring the situation closely because Putin's announcement has already created ripple effects in global markets, with oil and gas prices climbing again as fears grow that the conflict may intensify or spread, especially if supply routes become disrupted or additional sanctions are imposed in response to any escalation on the battlefield or in political messaging. From Moscow and Kyiv, reports from Ukrainian cities show residents preparing for further instability, with power outages becoming more frequent and emergency services working around the clock to deal with the aftermath of drone strikes, missile barrages, and infrastructure damage that has left communities vulnerable and anxious about what may come next as both military and political tensions remain high. Meanwhile, Russian state media is presenting Putin's statement as a firm and necessary position, arguing that the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces is essential for securing areas that Russia considers under its control, and insisting that Moscow will not compromise on what it views as territorial integrity, even as international leaders reject those claims. Under international experts in conflict resolution say that the current moment represents one of the most critical phases of the war, because the gap between the demands of both sides appears wider than ever, making the path toward negotiation extremely difficult and potentially setting the stage for further intensification of fighting as commanders on both sides attempt to secure tactical advantages before any future diplomatic talks. In Kyiv, officials stressed that Ukrainian morale remains strong despite brutal fighting and challenging conditions. Soldiers on the front lines continue to resist Russian advances, while defenders in key positions work tirelessly to hold strategic locations that are vital to preventing deeper penetration into Ukrainian territory, which remains a top priority for military planners. Satellite imagery and independent monitoring groups are observing increasing troop movements, equipment deployments, and fortified positions, suggesting that both sides are preparing for a long conflict cycle rather than an immediate resolution, particularly as Putin's statement signals that Russia intends to maintain pressure until Ukrainians meet conditions that Kyiv has already rejected. In contested regions continue to evacuate as clashes intensify, and humanitarian corridors remain difficult to maintain, with many families leaving behind homes and livelihoods unsure when or if they will be able to return, and struggling to access medical care, supplies, and safe shelter as winter storms complicate evacuation routes and rescue operations. As diplomatic responses continue, International leaders are urging restraint and calling for renewed dialogue, even as they acknowledge that prospects for peace remain uncertain given the rigidity of Russia's demands and Ukraine's firm refusal to concede any territory, which sets the stage for a prolonged confrontation that may reshape security dynamics in Europe for years to come. Experts highlight that weapon supplies, drone technology, air defense systems, and artillery ammunition will play a significant role in determining the direction of the conflict in the coming months, because both sides rely heavily on external support, logistics networks, and strategic planning to sustain operations across a wide and heavily contested battlefield. Ukrainian commanders focusing on strengthening defensive lines while preparing countermeasures to offset Russian advances, including expanded drone use, enhanced surveillance operations, and improved coordination between frontline units, which they hope will slow Russian momentum and prevent further breakthroughs that could destabilize entire regions. Russian forces are reportedly continuing to push deeper into eastern sectors using a mix of infantry assaults, mechanized units, and drone-guided artillery fire to pressure Ukrainian defenses, with some analysts suggesting that these operations are designed to create facts on the ground ahead of any potential negotiations, giving Russia stronger leverage in diplomatic discussions across European capitals. Governments are preparing for renewed waves of refugees, disruptions to supply chains, and energy concerns, as officials warn that instability could continue for months or longer, depending on how both sides respond to Putin's declaration and how the battlefield evolves in the near future as winter conditions worsen and operational challenges increase. Through all these developments, one fact remains certain: the conflict has reached yet another critical turning point, and the international community is watching closely as world leaders, diplomats, and military analysts attempt to understand how this latest declaration will shape the next stage of a war that has already transformed global politics, economies, and security strategies. We will continue to follow this developing situation with updates as new information becomes available from QE Moscow and the various international agencies working to monitor, assess, and respond to the rapidly changing dynamics shaping this conflict.